Original intention when designing this piece was to use materials and methods that would act as a tribute to the original contractors, engineers, and the history of New Braunfels. When acquiring the wood for the tabletop, I had to reach out to Duke Sawyer Lumberworks. Duke had a piece that was originally harvested from the banks of the Comal River, located not far from the Faust Street Bridge. I thought the color of the walnut would go well with the table base. My first step was figuring out the dimensions of the tabletop and squaring up these rough slabs. I don't currently have a track saw in my arsenal, but an old timer from a bridge crew I worked on showed me this trick for making your own, and it works pretty well. It's simply a 1 foot wide piece of plywood with a piece of trim attached to the top. The edge of the saw rides along the trim, keeping your cuts straight. Once the slabs are cut, I then used a roundover bit on my router to break the edge on all sides. Once that was complete, I did some rough sanding to remove some of the chine and to assess which side I was going to use for the top. One of the details I liked about these pieces was that during its time on the Comal River, a family of bees had burrowed into it and made it their home. Once all loose material was removed, I was then able to tape off the perimeter and any holes that may allow epoxy to leak through. This was one of my first times using epoxy to fill voids in wood, and I made plenty of mistakes. My first mistake can be seen here, where I'm using my eye and mixing cups to mix the epoxy. I didn't pay close enough attention to how many parts A and how many parts B I put into the mixing cup. And what ended up happening is this material set up, but it did not completely harden, and I had to remove it all with a chisel 3 days later. After pouring several lifts of epoxy and allowing it to cure, I was able to come back and sand. Over multiple passes, I worked my way up to 1000 grit. I'm interested to get other people's feedback on what grit they like to sand to when using a hard wax finish. I bought a kit from Woodcraft Store, and one of the members there recommended working up to 1000, but I'm interested in hearing what other people like. I decided to go with an Odie's oil finish because I wanted to go with a more natural look, and I wanted something that was easy for the future owner to reapply years down the road. I really liked the look of the Odie's and how it pulled the grain out of this piece. I ended up liking the side pictured here more than I liked the side with the epoxy, partly because of the grain, but also because I felt the epoxy detracted from the table base itself. I wanted historically accurate hardware for this piece. I never realized how difficult it was going to be to find square-headed bolts. One thing that made these specific bolts difficult was because I needed them unplated. This was because I wanted to blacken them to match the table base with an oil finish. If these had been plated, the plating would have had to been removed and then oil blackened with this process shown here. If you didn't watch my previous videos, the oil blackening process is just simply heating the material up and then quenching it in oil or spraying oil on. From my understanding, this causes the oil to rapidly oxidize and harden and create a surface similar to that as gun bluing. Now that my hardware was blackened and ready to go, I needed to mount the tabletop to the brackets. Because of the odd shape of the base and the actual weight of it, I didn't want to place it on the underside of the table and risk marring the surface. So I decided to use the wall as a gauge to measure from to square the base and to center it. Since I wanted the hardware to be historically accurate, I searched all over multiple hardware stores and online stores to find brass wood screws that were slotted. Using soap makes this process a lot easier because it acts as a lubricant when turning the screws. This is definitely the most nervous I've ever been installing fasteners, but those of you who have used slotted screws know how often it is for your driver to slip off and mar your surface. Once the tabletop was fastened to the brackets, I was then able to square the top with the base and tighten the bolts. Now that this piece is done, I find myself reflecting a lot on how much time actually went into this base. I think it took approximately 80 hours as far as the overall construction, but the amount of history I researched, the diving into old archives, learning new processes, buying new tools, I can't even count how many hours has gone into this. But the actual process, I think, has been more rewarding than most anything that I've done. I appreciate all the great feedback from those of you who've been watching with experience in hot riveting and woodworking, and I look forward to future projects. Thanks for watching.